I'm going to touch upon all those, but at a level that perhaps at first is going to sound a little too Darren called God's eye view. It's just sort of like taking a breath, but not necessarily using the G word, or maybe just in a different way. But I think it's just stepping out and looking in and taking stock of 10 years and the kinds of things that I learned from the field, not just the journal. And slowly, though, moving into a direction where I think that is going to be my contribution in terms of the ongoing dialogue that we would want to have at CCIG, but also in broader community of scholars on the issue of citizenship. Where do we draw the lines? My colleague Graham Thompson just recently in a workshop we held on the good citizen that was organized by, co-organized by Mike Sayward, mentioned that he gets worried, and this was raised today earlier by Zoe, earlier, the issue of where do we draw the boundaries? If we begin to use citizenship along with any adjective that we can come up with, queer citizenship, S&M citizenship, transgender citizenship, ecological citizenship, cosmopolitan citizenship, and then there's a concern addressed, rightfully so, where do we draw the boundaries? And this directly relates to the issue, of course, to our remit, as it were, in citizenship, the Center of Citizenship, Identities and Governance, CCIG. Where do we draw the boundaries, and what is the connecting tissue between governance, identities, and citizenship? That connecting tissue, I suggested with a little teaser at the end of the first panel that was missing from the first panel. By saying missing, though, this is not a criticism, it's not absence, because the center's remit is not necessarily just to focus on connecting tissue, the relationship between those three. There can be quite legitimate research, and there is, that actually does not address one or the other. But the connecting tissue is significant in terms of what idiom, what language we're going to articulate in the next few years that will enable us to speak across those strands. Of course, that doesn't mean that that dialogue doesn't already exist, but the contribution I want to make with that little teaser actually lay out what I see as the connecting tissue. That's what I hope to do, and what I'll do is to warm up partially, and also partially just to give you a broader sense of how I see the three strands independently. So before I can actually address the connecting tissue, I want to articulate some conceptual analytical categories that I found in my work useful to reflect on each, because my work actually involved all three. Not necessarily I have made connections, let alone successful connections, but I have done work on governance and governmentality. I have done work on the formation of particular urban identities. I have done work on citizenship. So there is a connecting tissue that I am not necessarily very successful in making it all the time either. So this is also an experimental and to create an ongoing dialogue. So let me say a few things about those three. What I'm going to do is that actually I'm going to start with the third one, governance. What we have learned in the last 10 years. 10 years, not because we have been involved in doing work in the last 10 years, but that's been also the span where we have been involved in citizenship studies. So I'm just sort of taking that as 10 years as our stock of experience. One of the things that we have experienced in the usage of that term, government and then governance, is that in the literature in social sciences, there has been considerable shift from recognizing government as what governments do, as instituted authorities, but to expand the boundaries of what governance means to differentiated actors, institutions, acts, and other kinds of entities that talk about government or governance. if we define broadly, as Michel Foucault did, governance as conduct of conduct, that is the impact that one does on the other, on the action field of the other, then governance comes to include not only what governments do, of course that's what governments also do, but also a variety of constituted actors. We also know that in the last 10 years there has been considerable discussion about modes of governance, that not all forms of governance, modes of governance are identical or even similar. There are engaging and alienating forms of governance or modes of governance. There are enabling and disabling modes of governance. And then there's inclusive and exclusive, and perhaps also significantly they talked about liberal and illiberal modes of governance, to which we could also include authoritarian modes of governance. So then we have come to sort of think of the activity of government in a more nuanced and complicated ways in the last 10 years than before, at least from the lens of, let's say, citizenship studies. Then, of course, we have layered other meta-theoretical categories on the way in which modes of governance are activated. I particularly use the trilogy of understanding the ways in which how individuals and social groups act upon the social field that opens from one another by using various orientations toward each other. Deploying certain strategies of getting other social groups to modify their behavior to the extent that it is defined as the objective of government, and using certain technologies. And technologies, again, understood in broader terms of ways of enacting upon others, rather than meaning hardware. Although in the questions of cyberspace and the internet democracy and so on, they come to touch each other as well. The technology is understood as ways of enacting on others and hardware and various protocols and so on. So in terms of governance then, we are no longer speaking about just simply what governments do or even only states do, but as well as states and governments, a variety of actors, a very complex field of governance in which actors take space and act upon each other. There's that image of thought, as Deleuze would have it, or would say, emerge in the last decade or so. Now, in terms of identities, I don't need to say much either because of the panel. You know, we have been, Anne had a very nice quote from Stuart Hall. Yes, now we take for granted a number of things. We take for granted multiplicities, hybridities, unfixed, changing, fluid conception of identities. There's multiplicity and so on. But also there is an increased concern about, but once identities are formed, they are also formed, aren't they? To me, this tension between identity and identities partly speaks to that. And I don't think it's resolvable, actually, by making any decisions about either or both. It really is a tension in the way in which the way we relate to the world changes and how it gets actually layered by the way in which other groups and other individuals are forming their identities. There is really no escaping that. But there's also the issue often talked about, Bourdieu's struggle over this, the tension between objectivism and subjectivism, or between sort of social constructivism and essentialism, or the issue of universalism and particularism. And his point, along with other scholars in social sciences, was, in fact, these are not dichotomies to be overcome, but we have to negotiate it through these. And these are not choices that one has to take up and accept as one.